What is that? Brown Magazine?
Brown.
Unbelievable.
Well, he said, he really had a great article. Great article. So he said, what did you think? I said, I like the jacket.
All right, yeah.
I understand that the one that's going to speak.
Yeah. March, yeah. Should be nice.
So
Stuart Weinblatt.
we were coming back from my niece's, my wife's niece's, all the way up in Ontario for Shabbat.
Uh-huh.
She gets a text, all work by highest, and all the organizations that get any federal funding that, to help, suspended.
Amazing. Well, that's what America voted for. You knew he was going to do it.
I'm sure you had this.
Can I give this to you? Good Shabbos. How's it going?
Good, how are you?
Good. It's chilly in here.
Yeah, it's chilly everywhere.
Oh my gosh. Feels terrible.
So we ready to go? How many commits so far?
Doesn't look good. Unfortunately. You know, 3 nights I had enough. And then Howard and his friends were talking about it. Yeah. And then we lost like 8 games. Because that was 4 couples that I needed. So we're going to try to do it again in the fall.
Is that because some of us initially committed with our spouses?
No, not at all. Daughters having a baby. And then, well, if you're not going, we're not going. And then they get first class flight. So, okay, I kind of felt, after all that, so maybe we're trying to do it again in the fall, and maybe more lead up time. But it's frustrating. I thought we were there.
We do it again.
Keep trying. I appreciate your.
It's amazing how long.
God, David Deutsch. I wanted to kill him.
Oh, he's
It's amazing.
classic.
It's like the stuff you sometimes got to, it's like the personalities and the stuff you deal with. Just
Yeah. And he wasn't one of the tough ones. Between us. Shabbat Shalom.
That would be a good day to have schnapps.
Oh. This is
What are you complaining about?
inhuman. Yeah, in the north where it's 2 degrees, but we braved it. Yeah. There we go. Lasod et HaShabbat לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. וביום השביעי שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא פרי הגפן, אמן. לחיים.
Could have been schnapps. Grape juice.
Hey, you're welcome to bring your own bottles. You're welcome. Yeah.
If I did, I share.
All right. Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos.
Blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot k'divrei Torah. Amen. Okay, Torah portion is called Va'era. Second Torah portion in the book of Exodus. We're going to begin. We really want to look at chapter 7 and 8, which is the second triennial cycle. But before we do that, I want to look at just a few verses in chapter 5 to build up to where we're going. So, if you don't mind, we're going to start chapter 5, verse 1 of Exodus. Now, if you look on the sheet, you'll see that the only sources that I brought were Rashi, with the exception of Nachmanides, the Ramban's very famous and very long commentary from the end of chapter 13, and I only brought parts of it because the rest of it is extremely lengthy, and we only needed a few sections of it. Now, normally, pretty much always, all I do is come to these classes and repeat the other ideas of great rabbis and imply that some of them were mine. That's usually, which is like...
We know about it.
Right, which is like a big sin. You're not allowed to do that. Yeah. But today I had, so today I want to build up and show you what Rashi thinks. And then at the end tell you an idea that I had, that I think, and you can agree or disagree, but it's just something that I thought after looking through these verses. Now, I was listening to a lecture from a rabbi named Rabbi Liebtag. He's a contemporary Orthodox rabbi. And he was, actually no, I got this from Bravender. I listened to one of his lectures, didn't like it so much. Listened to another one from a rabbi who I've quoted often, Rabbi Chaim Bravender, also a contemporary rabbi from Israel. And he said, he was basically just guiding through Rashi, which is what I want to do, before I get to some other ideas. But I always looked at, so we have Va'era, this week's Torah portion, the first 7 plagues. Next week's Torah portion, Bo, the last 3. And I always looked at, not always, but for a long time anyway, I looked at the different plagues. I love to ask my 7th grade students, why do you need 10 different plagues? Why not just have blood 10 times? The blood was working. They couldn't handle the blood. Turn off the blood. We can't take the blood. Right? Blood's the first plague. Pharaoh said, I can't take it. Turn off the blood. Turns off the blood. Okay, I changed my mind. You can't leave. Turn back the blood. They don't. So, okay, so the general understanding is that, well, Pharaoh would have said, yeah, okay, you defeated my water god. But I got lots of other gods. So the other plagues had to attack the different gods. And then there's some other things why as well. By the way, there's a strong belief from the rabbis that the first 3 plagues affected the Jews also. And even though it says in the Torah that there was water, where the Jews were, Ibn Ezra comes and says, no. If the first 3 plagues didn't affect the Jews as well, then Pharaoh would have just said, our God's angry at us for something, and so he's attacking us, but he's not attacking them. But the fact that the Jews were affected by it also took away that excuse. That it wasn't his gods that were doing it. Because his gods would do it for everybody, and so forth. So we had to take that away. So there's a lot of different theological battles. But I want to suggest not so much a theological battle here, I'm not suggesting anything, I'm just pointing out what the Midrash says that Rashi picked up on. Not so much a theological battle between God and Pharaoh, which is how we usually look at this. This was a war between Egypt and the Israelites, but the Jews never fight. The Egyptian army does. The Egyptian army gets into gear. They hop on their chariots. They rush out into the wilderness. What do the Jews do? One guy jumps in the water. That's the sum total of the Israelite military strategy. Everyone else complained. I'll hold up a stick. You jump in the water. That was it. Now, on the other side, it's not because they don't know how to fight. Because they cross the Red Sea. Amalek comes to attack, and what do? They go to war. And there's an actual battle. They fight. But on this side, they're not ready to fight yet. So, there's a theological war between gods. Because Pharaoh thinks that he's a god. And God is pretty sure that he's a god. Right? All right. So let's begin chapter 5, and there's a that's from A Few Good Men. When he says to the judge, I demand to be called sir or something, and the judge goes, I'm quite sure I've earned it. Whatever. I don't know what makes that judge thinks he's so great. But all right, whatever. Chapter 5, verse 1. Norman, here we go. Into the mic, please. For both people watching at home. Okay. Here we go.
Afterward, Moses and Aaron went and said to the Pharaoh, Thus says the Eternal, the God of Israel, Let my people go that they may celebrate a festival for me in the wilderness. But Pharaoh said, Who is the Eternal that I should heed him and let Israel go? I do not know the Eternal, nor will I let Israel go.
Okay. So the way the conversation starts of let my people go, if we look closely, Moses and Aaron come together, and they say, Ko Amar Hashem Elokei Yisrael. So says God, the Lord of Israel. And Pharaoh, after keeping the Israelites slaves for 210 years, is probably thinking to himself, if there's one thing I'm worried about, it's not the God of these people. I think I have them pretty well under control. I mean, if they had a God, where has he been? I don't know who you're talking about. Now, Pharaoh wouldn't have doubted that they had a God because everyone back then believed that everyone had a God of some sort. But Pharaoh seemed to believe that whoever their God is, it doesn't matter because I've subdued him. My gods are better than their gods. Right? Did you see Gladiator 2? So in the beginning, there's a lot of talk about going to war and the gods. May the gods be with us. And you get that sense that back then, everyone believed that there were gods on our side and gods on your side. It's really interesting. But what does Pharaoh say here? Pharaoh's reaction to, Moses and Aaron come and say, we're here on behalf of our God. Pharaoh's reply is, who? Is that a serious request? Who? Okay. And he says, Lo yadati et Hashem. I don't know this person that you call God. V'gam et Yisrael. And whoever you say his people is, I'm not impressed. Now, something very interesting, you know, when we get later to the Torah, there are other people who are the leaders of the Jewish people besides Moses and Aaron, and they're called Ziknei Yisrael, the elders of Israel. Now, who are the elders of Israel? The 50 people that came to Torah Study every Shabbos morning. Like, Bill Silver was there. No,
He told us all
he
about it.
was there, yeah. He comes to me after every class and says, "That's not how it happened." All right. So look what Rashi says on 5:1. Edith, would you mind reading that one, the first Rashi, and afterwards?
And afterwards Moses and Aaron came. But the elders slipped away one by one from behind Moses and Aaron until every one of them had slipped away before they arrived at the palace, because they were afraid to go there.
Right, so they said, all right, what's the plan? Moses and Aaron says, we're going to go to Pharaoh and we're going to tell him our God says, let our people go. And the rest of the elders look at Moses and Aaron and say,
Are you crazy?
that's your plan? Good luck. I mean, well, that's what you're going in there with. Okay, so they said, we're not interested. And, okay, a little further, Edith.
At Sinai, they were punished for this, for it is stated in Exodus 24:2, and Moses alone shall draw near unto the Lord, but they, the elders, that is in Exodus 24:1, shall not draw near. He bid them stay behind.
So something interesting about the elders. This is not their greatest moment, but they remain the elders. And they keep their job as some sort of leaders. And if you look through Pirkei Avot, when we talk about what is oral law, Pirkei Avot explains that Moses passed the Torah, or God gave it to Moses, the oral part. Moses gave it to Joshua. Joshua gave it to the elders. And then they started teaching it to the people. So this isn't their best moment, but they don't lose their job. Why? What's so good about them? No. Okay, so let's go back to the text. We're up to, Judy, we're up to what, verse 3. Chapter 5, verse 3.
They answered, the God of the Hebrews has manifested himself to us. Let us go, we pray, a distance of 3 days into the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he strike us with pestilence or sword. But the king of Egypt said to them, Moses and Aaron, why do you distract the people from their tasks? Get to your labors. And the Pharaoh continued, the people of the land are already so numerous, and you would have them cease from their labors. That same day, Pharaoh charged the taskmasters and foremen of the people, saying, you shall no longer provide the people with straw for making bricks as heretofore. Let them go and gather straw for themselves, but impose upon them the same quota of bricks as they've been making heretofore. Do not reduce it, for they are shirkers. That is why they cry, let us go and sacrifice to our God.
Okay. So that's a weird exchange. Before we go further, I just want to show you what Rashi says about verse 6. In verse 6, he says, order the taskmasters over the people and its guards. And Rashi tells us who the taskmasters are. They were Egyptians. But look what it says. The taskmaster over its people and its guards. So Rashi asks the question, who are the taskmasters and who are the guards? The guard are the Yudenrat. Right? Does it sound familiar? They were Jews placed over other Jews. However, there was something good about them. And this is why, remember before I said, even though this wasn't their shining moment, they keep their jobs. Look what Rashi says. They were the Egyptians. But the shotrim, the guards, which is the same way you say policemen in modern Hebrew, were Israelites. A taskmaster was given charge over the bailiffs, and a shoter was appointed to have control over the workmen. But what we'll see later is that the elders, later on, it's explained, why are they promoted to be elders, because what would the taskmasters do? They would come and they would say to the guards, your workers that you're watching over didn't produce enough bricks, so we're going to whip you. They were supposed to be whipping the Jews, the slaves, to make enough bricks, but they refused to do that. And instead, they took the beatings themselves to protect the rest of the people, and that's why they kept their jobs and deserved to be the elders. Judenrat, in the Holocaust, in most cases, was not the case. They were bad guys. Okay. Okay, so now that that's clear, that's just sort of, oh, by the way, it's not the main point that I wanted to focus on, but what is the theological significance here? Because look what we're saying. We want to leave. No, you can't leave. Okay, then we want to go worship our God. No, you can't go worship your God because you're lazy. What? Did you catch that? So look what verse 3. Let us go for a 3-day journey to worship God. And Pharaoh says, that sounds like a junket to me. You know, you say you're going to work, but you just really want to get out of work for a few days. Right? And then he says, Moses and Aaron, they're busy. What are you bothering them with this religious nonsense? Just keep to work. And then he says, and you know what? I'm going to make it even harder for you because you're causing trouble. And we're going to have this new taskmaster system, and the Jews are going to watch over you. And we all know this famous thing about, I'm not going to give you straw. Okay? Now, in verse 9, he says, we're going to make the work even heavier, and so forth. Now, let's skip to verse 12. Because look what happens. Ken, would you, verse 12.
Then the people scattered throughout the land of Egypt to gather stubble for straw. And the taskmasters pressed them, saying, you must complete the same work assignment each day as when you had straw. And the foremen of the Israelites, whom Pharaoh's taskmasters had set over them, were beaten. Why, they were asked, did you not complete the prescribed amount of bricks, either yesterday or today, as you did before? Then
okay, now, they have to go out and gather the straw, and while it doesn't say it specifically, they're successful. They're able to collect enough straw, and ultimately, they're producing the same amount of bricks. So when he said, my translation says, and let them not engage in words of falsity. So va'al yishu, I guess it means don't let them like engage, I guess. Divrei sheker means falsehoods. Divrei means words, and sheker means to lie. So falsehoods. Rashi says, let them not constantly contemplate and speak of pointless words. Meaning, essentially what he's saying is, going to sacrifice to your God is nothing. Because you're going to still come back and be slaves. So what are you wasting your time for? Get them to stop wasting their time and stop believing that anything's ever going to save them. Now, that's what Rashi says. I mean, there may be more to the story. I don't know much else about it. But something very interesting happens. So now I want to skip to our section, the Triennial Cycle 2, chapter 7.
Can I ask you one question as you're flipping pages there?
Yeah, but we're going to go to chapter 7, verse 20.
So
please.
maybe that last verse that we read proves that the Israelites actually, maybe they were a little bit shirkers, because somehow they were able to produce the same amount of bricks when they didn't have to gather the straw than when they did. So before they had to gather the straw, they were kind of laying back a little bit,
Might have
whatever.
been. Might have been. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know. That's
Well,
the other
there's a story that says, listen, Pharaoh wants us to build these buildings. And so we'll build them. But we want to do it with the least amount of work possible. And that's how this idea of architecture buried. So they said, okay, we made a platform. Tomorrow, let's make it a little bit not as long. And the next day, a little bit not as long. And this was the world's first ever pyramid scheme. I didn't make it up. All right, chapter 7, verse 20. Bill, would you mind? Chapter 7, verse 20. Sorry. 20. That's what I meant.
All right. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded. He lifted up the rod and struck the water in the Nile in the sight of Pharaoh and his courtiers. And all the water in the Nile was turned into blood, and the fish in the Nile died. The Nile stank so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile, and there was blood throughout the land of Egypt. But when the Egyptian magicians did the same with their spells, Pharaoh's heart stiffened, and he did not heed them as the Lord had spoken. Pharaoh turned and went into his palace, paying no regard even to this. And all the Egyptians had to dig around about the Nile for drinking water, because they could not drink the water of the Nile.
Okay. So the first plague starts. The first plague is blood. And there's blood everywhere. But look what happens in verse 22. So in verse 22, there are these people, if you look at the Hebrew, if you can, v'ya'asu chen, they did it. Who? These people called the Khartoumim, or Khartoumei Mitzrayim, but Khartoumim. The Khartoumim were this class of people in Egypt who were the magicians, but they were like a class of people who knew how to do these spells and sorcery and stuff like that. And later on, when there are a group of people who leave Egypt with the Jews and say, we're Egyptian, but we see the power of your God and we want to convert and be with you, that's who it was, these people. And they're later referred to as the Eruv Rav, the mixed multitudes. Which, by the way, Eruv is also that name of what they're called later is a reference to one of the plagues. Right. Dam, Sfardeya, Kinim, Arov, the fourth one. The fourth one is generally like different type of insects and things that attack the Egyptians, but it was a mixture of scorpions, and it was all different kinds of things called Arov. And so later on, when there are these Khartoumim who leave with the Jews, they're referred to as that type of weird mixture. So when the Jewish people, if you remember, the golden calf? So they throw the gold into the fire, and out pops the golden calf, right? Nobody fashioned it. So how did you take gold, throw it in a fire, and out pops it in the form of a calf? And who's interested in worshiping calves? These sorcerers. They did their spells, and out popped the golden calf. So these are people who believe in some sort of black magic, and it exists. The Torah believes that this type of powerful black magic exists. And one of the ways that we know that is, of the 613 commandments, a couple of them say you're not allowed to do that stuff. There are no mitzvahs that say you're not allowed to do stuff that doesn't exist. Right? Don't get a tattoo. Why? Because you could get a tattoo. Don't put cheese on. All right. That one's not for us. That one's not for us. Somewhere in here it says you can go to Joe's, but order the salmon. I forget what page it's on.
Order the fried chicken.
Richard?
I hear Moses striking the water because he did exactly as God said. I don't know exactly what God says to Moses.
Oh, okay.
My next recollection of Moses striking something is the rock.
Right.
Forth the water. And that's not what.
Well, the first time he does it, God does tell him to strike the rock. The second time he does it, he tells him, speak to the rock. So there's a lot going on with the water, right? I mean, first of all, it's water that saves Moses' life, right? When he's put in the river. It's water that destroys the Egyptians. It's water that, right, in the Red Sea. It's water that, well, the first plague has to do with water. It's water that brought the Jews to Egypt in the first place, because of the Nile they were able to grow crops, and then it's water that gets Moses in trouble. So there's a lot of different things going on with water, and we could talk. That would take us in a totally different direction, but it's important. It's very important, and there's a lot going on here. And it's true when it does say in verse 19. When God instructs Moses what to do and says, take your staff, it says, what's the word? V'nateh. Nateh is not yach. Nateh is to stretch over. There's a different word for hit. And so he does stretch it here. He is told to stretch here. But then when you get to verse 20, he does use the verb vayach. So in other words, what Richard says is right. God says, stretch out your hand, and Moses hits the water. Now, is he supposed to hit the water? He's not punished for it, but it's interesting foreshadowing. He stretched it out like God commanded. Right.
Ease him through the rest of Exodus.
You know what's interesting, actually? Here's what's interesting. In verse 19, who is instructed to take the staff in verse 19? Aaron. Very good. God tells Moses, tell Aaron. I used to tell my brother to do things. We would go play golf.
How well did that go?
Not good. We would go play golf together, and he would hit a ball and lose it in the woods. And I would yell at him for not watching his ball where it landed, because then we have to go look for it. Then I'd hit a ball in the woods, and I'd yell at him for not watching my ball for where it landed. And then he pointed that out one day, and I realized, yeah, that's annoying. But then in verse 20, it says Moses and Aaron did so, as God commanded. But then it says he held the staff aloft and struck the water. He, singular. Is that Aaron or Moses? I actually don't know. Probably Aaron. Probably Aaron who makes the mistake there, because it's his staff that we're dealing with. And by the way, there are different times when Moses actually hits the rock and gets punished. It's with Aaron's staff. It's not with his own staff. It's with Aaron's staff. And we did that class. That was, we have that class. Okay. I wanted to point out, the reason I wanted to look at this section of chapter 7, though, is for verse 22. So let's get back to the Khartoumim. My translation refers to them as the necromancers. What does Plout say? Magicians. Okay, so whatever. Either way, they performed in Vegas. And they did the...
In the sphere, right?
Tough crowd. They did the same with their charms. And Pharaoh's heart became hardened and he didn't listen to them. So this isn't so theological. Pharaoh here says, big deal. Your guy could do it. My guy can do it. So look at Rashi on verse 22, right in the middle of the page. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened. So why was Pharaoh so stubborn? So that he said, you're doing this by witchcraft. Doing what by witchcraft? So you know what Pharaoh just realized? The Jews did something amazing. The Jews created the same amount of bricks without providing straw in the same amount of time. And he said, wow, these Jews pulled a fast one. How did they do that? So look what he said. He said, you are doing this by witchcraft. You're bringing straw to Apharaim, which was the city in Egypt where you got the straw, and you're doing your own sorcery by getting all of that straw.
What verse are you on, Rabbi?
Well, this is 22. This is Rashi on 22. But Rashi takes this from Yasim Menachot and Exodus Rabbah, which means this is from the Talmud and from the Midrash. Now, you don't have to believe that. But what the point that the Talmud and the Midrash are trying to make is that it looks like Pharaoh said, yeah, you Jews, you think you're going to get out of here because you've figured out sorcery too. And now you're doing this thing with the blood. But let me show you something. I get sorcerer's tricks. And I'm not letting you go because you figured out some tricks the way I know some tricks. Which is interesting. Now, it shouldn't seem to us like such a far stretch that someone like Pharaoh, who thought himself was a god, believed in sorcery. Right? And maybe it really existed. I mean, how else would, if he doesn't really believe in God yet, but he sees that there's blood everywhere, how else could that happen? Now, there is a show on National Geographic who said, oh yeah, this happened in Africa like 80 years ago. There were this big school of fish and they all got sick. And it turned a river somewhere all red from the blood of the fish. And then the frog said, we don't like living in this blood. We're going to jump out. And they jumped out and that got on everyone's skin and that brought, like lice and stuff. And that, I don't know how they did and then there was this other, I don't know, they even had an explanation for the death of the firstborn, which some kind of gas that was created, and the firstborns used to sleep on the ground, on their bunk beds. They were on the ground, and this gas only affected and one night there was in one house, the firstborn was out with his friend, and he slept over his friend's house, and so the younger brother slept on the first floor, but the gas said to the other gas, leave him alone. And then so they went to the next house. So this is actually more likely. This is actually more reasonable than the National Geographic explanation of. Okay, now we can go to chapter 8. Chapter 8, verse 1. Genya, would you mind reading? Chapter 8 of Exodus, verse 1.
And the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, hold out your arm with the rod over the rivers, the canals, and the ponds, and bring up the frogs on the land of Egypt. Aaron held out his arm over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. But the magicians did the same with their spells and brought frogs upon the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, plead with the Lord to remove the frogs from me and my people, and I will let the people go to sacrifice to the Lord.
Okay, you see what's weird between verses 2 and 4 here? So, again, the Egyptians, taskmasters, are able to accomplish the same task. right? We get that from verse 3. This is my translation. The necromancers did the same through their incantations, and they brought up the frogs from the land of Egypt. So now there are frogs that are bothering people that Moses and Aaron summoned from God. And there are the Egyptian frogs that are also coming. But how is Pharaoh going to get rid of these frogs? Why not just go to his necromancers and say, get rid of all the frogs? Do you see if my guys can bring frogs too, big deal. Before I beg Moses and Aaron to get rid of the frogs, why not ask my guys if they could give it a shot? Right? So look at verse 4 now. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. He doesn't do that. And look what he says. And he used the word tiru, which is not an easy word to say. If you're an Israeli in law school, you would know this word. It's has to do with appeals and different type words in modern Hebrew. But here means entreat God. So do you see that we've gone in a couple of chapters to, I don't even know who your God is. I don't believe in your God. I think you're doing sorcery with your straw and all these things, just like we're doing sorcery. But now all of a sudden in chapter 8, wait a minute. I don't think this is sorcery. I need your God to do something that my people can't. That's right. That's right. Oh, very nice. Very nice. Very nice idea. So either way, though, whether it's the blood or the frogs, there's an evolution here now in what Pharaoh recognizes Moses and Aaron are capable of. Wow. Ooh. Very nice. Yeah. Well, I once played Ouija board, and it said you were going to do this, but then, no, I don't know. Jews aren't supposed to play that stuff. Now, this is good stuff. Yeah, really good ideas. So, in verse 5, Moses says to Pharaoh, a very interesting word. Rabbis even had a debate over how to translate this. But it says, Vayomer Moshe leparo. Moses says to Pharaoh, hit pa'er. Right? Which means, pa'er means to glorify. Alai. Glorify over me. And then we get specific. Now, if a plague was just to happen, you could say it was by chance. But if you could say exactly when it was going to start, then you had prior knowledge and you knew that it was a miracle or that God was doing it. And so Moses is actually being sarcastic here. He says, okay, you want it to start? What time would you like it? Let me know. Tell me an exact moment. We'll get it done. Because if the frogs just all died, Pharaoh might say, well, they're out of the water. We start frying them up. Escargot or whatever it is. No, that's snail. What are the frogs? Yeah, I don't know. Some of the misplaced Frenchmen from the Tower of Babel ended up in Egypt. They started eating the frogs, whatever. But if you could turn off the frogs right when you say, then that's your power. So if you look at Rashi now on verse 5, it says, "For what period shall I entreat for thee?" This is Moses with a little bit of sarcasm. I wasn't the first Jew to do it. With reference to the entreaty, which I shall make today regarding the destruction of the frogs, by what period do you wish that they should be destroyed? And you will see whether I can carry out my promise by the time which you will set me. Right? And he says, I will signify, when shall I pray? Okay, and so forth. And Moses also says here that it's not just going to happen, I have to pray for it. We have to ask for it. And we Jews have a way of doing that. It's called prayer. And I have to go do that. But just let me know when. You just let me know when, and I'll take care of it. Okay, now, what's the first plague is blood, second plague is frogs, the third plague is lice. Now, what's the difference between frogs, blood, and lice? Well, a lot of things. But the main thing is size. Okay? Blood in the Nile River is a massive thing. Frogs all covering the land is a massive thing. But lice are something that if they bother you, it drives you crazy, but you don't even see them. Until you get the comb and whatever. But they're tiny. And that plays a role here. So if you look with, let's see, Annabelle, would you mind continuing, picking up at verse 11? Chapter 8, verse 11.
Pharaoh saw that there had been a relief and kept making his heart stubborn. He did not heed them as Hashem had spoken. Verse 12. Hashem said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the land. It shall become lice throughout the land of Egypt." 13. So they did. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the land, and the lice infestation was on man and beast. All the dust of the land became lice throughout the land of Egypt. The sorcerers did the same with their incantations to draw forth the lice, but they could not.
Okay, this is a main turning point now. From this point, plague 3, the first 2 plagues, and by the way, remember the earlier tricks in the beginning before they even started the plagues? When Moses would throw down his staff and it would turn into a snake, and Pharaoh said, "Big deal, my guys can do that." And they did some things. And then they did the first 2 plagues. Now, third plague, verse 15, this is a major turning point. Now we're saying, for the first time, my guys can't do that. Okay? And so if you look now, Rashi on verse 15, bottom of the page, but they could not. For the demon through whose agency this was to be done is powerless in the case of a creature smaller than a barley corn. Therefore, they had to admit. They had to admit something, which means that they couldn't do it. And at that point, when Pharaoh is no longer able to have his guys do what Moses and Aaron can do, we come up with a new concept. Stubbornness. Right? Have you ever argued a case with your spouse when you knew you were wrong, but you kept arguing it because you were in too deep already? I don't know. Some of you are dishonest. We all do it. We all do.
But they know it.
So Pharaoh says, "Well, I'm in too deep already, and now I see that I can't humble." He says, so Pharaoh's heart became hardened. Now later on, God's going to harden his heart. There are different reasons for that. But here he does it on his own. His heart becomes hardened. He did not heed them as God had spoken. Okay, now skip to verse 20. Next plague, wild beasts. God did so, and a heavy mixture of wild beasts.
Insect.
Yeah, so my translation is wild beasts, but this is the arov. It was all sorts of different things. You know how you say Arov in Yiddish? Wildechaya. These are the Wildechayas. The wild chaya in Hebrew is animals. Wilda is wild animals. I mean, it also refers to grandkids. But, you know, the Wildechayas, they're running, but that's the term. That's about the extent of my Yiddish. And throughout the land of Egypt, the land is destroyed because of mixture. So if you look at Rashi, the first one on the second page, on the back page, Ha'eretz tishchat means the ground was being destroyed. So, and ruined because the Egyptians worshiped the ground as well because the ground produced food. And so that was a god to them. And so first God attacks the water, now he's attacking the ground. And between the lice, the frogs, and it took 3 plagues to destroy everything on the ground. And that's what happened. And if you look, just last verse, Exodus 8:27, it says, God did this in accordance with Moses' words, and he removed these wild beasts. And again, Rashi tells us, well, how did he get the wild beasts how to get the Arov to disappear? He concentrated his energies on prayer, which means that the prayers or the sorcery or the magic of whatever of the Khartoumim, the Egyptian necromancers, could only work within limits. But if you prayed really hard enough with God, you could achieve even what you didn't think was possible. Okay, now, all of that was to show that Pharaoh is broken down not so much by theology, but by the facts and by science. My people can do this. My people can do that. Now they can't. And now I'm stubborn. And now I need different arguments and different things. But it was maybe a little bit less theological and more just rational. I don't really even believe in your God. I don't believe you Jews have a God. I don't believe I'm at war with your God. I believe it's just you figured out some sorcery. But as it progresses, he starts to realize, whoa, this is more than sorcery. This is something I've never seen before. Now, I wanted to show you now Nachmanides, to maybe go in a little bit of a different direction and make a point that I thought of. And you could take it or leave it. Probably leave it, but we'll see where we go. So, Joe, do you have a mic? Would you mind reading the first chapter of Ramban? The first paragraph, now when God is?
Yeah, now when God is pleased to bring about a change in the customary and natural order of the world for the sake of a people or of an individual, then the voidance of all these false beliefs becomes clear to all people, since a wondrous miracle shows the world has a God who created it and who knows and supervises it and who has the power to change it.
Okay, so all of that Joe just read is answering the question, why do we need the 10 plagues? Couldn't God have just snapped his fingers and the Jews would now be in Israel or in Mount Sinai or wherever he wanted them? Couldn't he just have picked them up and said, now you're here, and now you're here? Couldn't he have just killed all the Egyptians? Couldn't he have just blinded all the Egyptians for a few weeks or a few days so that the Jews could just walk out? In other words, if you believe in a God who could do whatever he wants and can do all these miracles and all this stuff, why do we need the whole show? What is, part of it was, you'd come on Saturday morning and it would be like, well, what is there to talk about? And, I'd be out of a job, right? I mean, I could still do, talk about or whatever, but yeah.
We needed God to show us that he was the one and only God. And each event, he proved stronger than what Pharaoh had to put on the table.
Right, and 100%. And what Nachmanides adds here is, he did it in a way that changed the customary and natural order of the world. It was such a miraculous way that Pharaoh originally, you try to explain this by science, you try to explain this by sorcery. People today are still trying to explain this through science. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. This is God doing this in a way that shows that he can manipulate the world any way he wants and no one else can. But also what it shows is that the world was set up with scientific rules. How do we know that the sun is going to go down tonight? How do we know that it's going to come up tomorrow? How do we able to predict patterns of weather and so forth? Because God put in a system and left it there. Doesn't change it around all the time for no reason, right? So he created it, and if he's changing it, it must be to teach us something. Okay, so let's go on. Continuing with Nachmanides. Hillary, and when? Is that what it is?
And when that wonder is previously prophesied by a prophet, another principle is further established, namely that of the truth of prophecy, that God doth speak with man, and he revealeth his counsel unto his servants the prophets, and thereby the whole Torah is confirmed. This is why Scripture says in connection with the wonders in Egypt, that thou, Pharaoh, mayest know that I am the Eternal in the midst of the earth, which teaches us the principle of providence. That is, that God has not abandoned the world to chance, as they, the heretics, would have it. That thou mayest know that the earth is the Eternal's, which informs us of the principle of creation. For everything is his, since he created all out of nothing. That thou mayest know that there is none like me in all the earth, which indicates his might. That is, he rules over everything, and that there is nothing to withhold him. The Egyptians either denied or doubted all of these three principles, and the miracles confirmed their truth.
Okay, so the whole story has to be miraculous enough that the Jewish people become one with their belief in God. And we know they were already, getting into idol worship and turning away from Judaism, and it wasn't called Judaism at the time, but turning away from monotheism. But this whole story had to happen so that they could become one with God. And the reason is their souls, at this moment, more than any other time in history, had to be refined to perfection, because if they weren't refined to perfection, they wouldn't be able to receive Torah. They wouldn't get it when they received the Torah. And they wouldn't have accepted the Torah unless they're... So this is... Now, the other question, though, we could ask is, okay, fine, do all these miracles. Did we also have to be slaves for 210 years? Couldn't we have been slaves for like a year? 2 years? I mean, 210 years is a long time. Why did it have to be such an arduous punishment? On that question, let's conclude by looking at the second paragraph of Nachmanides, and then I'll tell you what I think, and then we'll conclude. Where it says, through the great.
Through the great open miracles, one comes to admit the hidden miracles which constitute the foundation of the whole Torah. For no one can have a part in the Torah of Moses, our teacher, unless he believes that all our words and our events, as dictated in the Torah, are miraculous in scope, there being no natural or customary way of the world in them, whether affecting the public or the individual. Instead, if a person observes the commandments, his reward will bring him success, and if he violates them, his punishment will cause his extinction. It is all by decree of the Most High, as I have already mentioned. The hidden miracles done to the public come to be known, as is mentioned in the assurances of the Torah on the subject of the blessings and imprecations, as the verse says, and all the nations shall say, wherefore hath the Eternal done thus unto this land? Then men shall say, because they forsook the covenant of the Eternal, the God of their fathers. Thus it will become known to all nations that their punishment came from God. And of the fulfillment of the commandments it says, and all the peoples of the earth shall see that the name of the Eternal is called upon thee.
Okay, so that's Nachmanides. Here's what I think he means, and here's what I think. So now, I admit that I'm biased. I'm on the side of the Jews. I'm on the side of Israel. And I told you that, one of my students at the University of Miami put on his evaluation of my course that occasionally the professor, but that's what he wrote, but the professor shows a bias towards Israel, and I appealed that. And I spoke to the head of the department, and I said, what do you mean occasionally? How dare you? It's always. So I appealed that. So I admit that I'm biased. But I would submit, you could take it or leave it, the two greatest moments or periods in Jewish history. The first one is Mount Sinai. Because the gift that the Jewish people gave the world at Mount Sinai was the Torah. And at least up to that point, and probably ever since, there has been no greater moral document that has ever entered the world than the Torah. And this is what I tell. Every once in a while, there's a concept called the annoying bar or bat mitzvah student. The one who comes and says, I don't even believe in God. Why do I have to do this? Right. I said, you don't. Well, but we want your parents to stay as members of the temple, so can we just try to get through this? No. But my real answer is, well, do you believe in being a good person? If they say no, then, the sociopath, we have a whole different set of problems. But they don't. They say, yes, I believe in being I've had this conversation many times. Do you believe in being a good person? Well, do you know of a better moral system than what we've provided the world? And whether or not it was created by people or God doesn't matter. This is our system to be good people. And if you believe in being a good person, this will help you do it, and it'll help you do it in a way that your people that you descend from have been doing for 4,000 years, whether you believe in God or not. And even with the most obstinate kids, that usually resonates. It actually resonates more than you have to do this because God said so. That, to the Reformed Jew, is not the most meaningful way of looking at it. But I would submit that it was when we brought the Torah into the world that we were at our very best. And it came after a 210-year period of abject hopelessness, slavery, punishment, degradation. But by the time it was over, because of all of the punishment, somehow the Jewish soul got refined. And I would submit, and this is where my bias comes in, so you can argue this if you want, but I think the second greatest moment in the history of the Jewish people, besides revelation at Mount Sinai, was 1948 to today. After, again, the most suffering our people have ever known, worse than Egypt probably, although Egypt was obviously a lot longer. But the Holocaust was more a culmination of 2,000 years of slavery. So worse than Egypt. And I don't think there's a country anywhere in the world, in world history, that in its first 76 years has accomplished what Israel has accomplished. Both spiritually, there are more people studying Torah now in the history than there's ever been in the history of the world, and that's because of the state of Israel. Economically, militarily, socially, the arts, the sciences. What country in its first 76 years has given more gifts to the world than the state of Israel? And both of these two periods of time happen to come immediately after the greatest degradation we have ever known. And I think in both cases, and I personally believe that the third Commonwealth, 1948 on, is the final Commonwealth, that Israel will never be destroyed. I believe that theologically. Not too many Reform rabbis necessarily would say that, but that's how I feel. And the Torah, which is also eternal, that was put into the world. that these two accomplishments, the state of Israel today and revelation at Mount Sinai, the two greatest accomplishments in the history of the Jewish people, came at a time after our greatest degradation, when, as Nachmanides is trying to explain, it took that to refine our souls, to humble ourselves to the lowest possible place. And who's Moses after all? The greatest compliment the Torah gives Moses? Moshe anav ma'od. Moses was very humble. And it's humility humility is what refines the soul more than anything. And at the two times where we were most humiliated and most humbled and most tortured and most degraded, and at the worst spot, that immediately after that, we had our finest moments and offered the world the greatest gifts that the Jewish people have ever given the world. And I think ultimately that's why the slavery had to be so severe, and maybe even while the diaspora between the end of the Second Commonwealth and the beginning of the Third Commonwealth had to have been so long, so torturous, and so horrible. Because once again, I think 1948, we re-accepted Torah and have brought it back to the world. So that's just what I think. You could take the last part or leave it. All right, Shabbat Shalom.
We'll keep it now.
Yeah. That's just my idea. I didn't steal it from anyone.
Friday night. We have a new Talmud Torah. All right.
Good Shabbos. Yeah. Oh, okay. Appreciate it.
Oh, I'd love to see it. That's amazing. I'm always very envious of people with that kind of talent, because I have none. That's amazing. It really is.
Yeah, but I never thought in those terms.
And you really do.
I enjoy those classes.
So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you.
I'm glad we had.
Yeah, but and that says about you, the kind of person that I'm giving you a compliment.
Yeah, I think so.
Which isn't
I
going
think
to
so.
happen again, so you better take it mystery. I'm giving him a compliment, and he should either take it or you know what he can do. And he said, you know, I've mentioned you before that lots of times when we go out, the other person never asks about me. Like, we have a conversation, and I say, so, how's work? Ken's my husband talking, how are your kids? What are they never ask me anything. And it just strikes me. I have, obviously, we have friends who do care, but a lot of people, they don't. And it does. He reminds me of a good friend of ours, Ben Cooney, he said. He's really interested. If he's not a lawyer, you're really interested in what the other person is doing. I was thinking this is a compliment. All right, that's it. Now I'll go back to being mean to you. What?
Minashita.